thank you everybody for coming out to our our February, I guess it is, but this is a week late, Friday live. We missed January, and we running a bit week late this year or this month, but we'll make it up. We'll make it up to you. We got a number of topics, but we had a bit of a last minute change. One of the things that we wanted to present today is Pearson, our UX designer, product designer. Unfortunately, he hurt his back last night, so he'll be unable to present today. And I'm going to skip most of the sort of news and announcements and updates and things like that. And I wanted to jump right into our topics. We had two topics lined up for today's meetup. The first one was web app optimizations and just some strategies there. And just before we started, we were talking about what does that mean to everybody? Does it mean, is it about pure performance, or is it about something else, or perception of the app and things like that? And then the second topic was is about using AI for code generation, for not only writing for code analysis. We'll look at code generation, code debugging, and I'll show you some examples of some code that we've done for that as well. So what I wanted to do is we're going to jump right into things. And I'm going to share my screen here. There we go. And unfortunately, as I mentioned, Pearson's unable to join us. But I wanted to jump into application performance. I know a number of people are not BetterForms users, so we're going to try to make this brief so it's not pure BetterForms centric. And I'm just going to strictly just go over some optimization ideas and concepts that you can use within your app. And if you have questions, by all means, either put them on chat or feel free to just chime in. And we'll be monitoring. The team's going to be monitoring the chat as well, and we'll address those questions as they come up. Like any application, and it doesn't really matter what your technology stack is. The more flexible the technology stack is, the more rope you have to make something poorly perform or perform in a really, really excellent manner. And FileMaker, as everybody knows, is very much like that. So what I want to do is I just wanted to start off with FileMaker optimizations and talk about things that we can do to make our FileMaker more performant. And I don't want to get into all the stuff that we always talk about in all the FileMaker meetups at all, because we've had a ton of community do lots of research on things, but I'll just talk about some things that aren't talked about quite as much. For the most part, the biggest strategy that you can use is kind of like we have a recycling program, and I think this is used all over. It's reduce, reuse, recycle. And you can do the exact same thing with code as well. Reduce, reuse, recycle, and not only in the development side, but also in the running or the optimization side. So I just want to talk about the first few things. It's about caching static or slowly changing data. This is one of the a really, really simple performance optimization thing that you can do. And this is not just a BetterForms thing. This is a FileMaker thing. If you have some type of data that you need to produce on a report or something like that, and it's very, very calculation intensive, this is a good opportunity to cache that. A lot of people are already doing that, taking their calcs and having maybe another shadow table of some sort and putting the calcs into that shadow table. When you're dealing with BetterForms or any type of web app, it's actually a little bit easier than that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump into a file here, and I'll just show you an example of that really quick. And this is how we often cache a lot of data. This is just a very, very simple file. But in this file, I have a table called, let's see, generic data store here. And it's a pretty simple table. It's just got an ID. And we have another key, a foreign key called ID owner. And I'll explain that in a second, and a data key. And we can put virtually anything inside this field. And the ID of the table is, let me see if I can find it here. The ID of the table, this is just a scratch layout. Let me create a new record, is that I can take something like, let's say I have some type of a list, like maybe a value list. and I'm going to call it my value list. And my value list, this is a unique key here, it can contain anything. It can contain names like Charles, Andrew, Eduardo, and so on, or it can contain JSON, it can contain HTML. It doesn't really matter what the contents are. The idea is that we generate the contents in one part of our script and we dump the value or dump that data in here. And then when we want to access that data, we use I'm going to use get column, which is a custom function that virtually everybody in our community is super familiar with. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to get column on the data field. So it's going to return the data field. This is an execute SQL wrapper function where the ID owner happens to be my, what do they call it? Value list. And you can see it return my data. So now I got one command line that returns this data, and I can put all different types of data in here. I can use this ID owner as a primary key to the actual entity that it belongs to. So if I wanted to cache a bunch of contacts and those contacts had really complicated balance summaries or something like that, I could throw that data in here as well, right parallel, right in line with value lists and everything else. So we're kind of flattening the data and we're treating it as one field. This becomes really, really performant because there's zero calculations to be done. And the execute SQL is very, very performant as well. If you have any questions on that technique, let me know. We've talked about this before though, I believe.
One little question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Is more quick than the list that you generate inside FileMaker?
Yes. Yeah, there's zero generation here.
Perfect.
There's nothing to be done here. The data is just raw data. You're just echoing it out. And this can be really big. You have a 200K piece of data, which may take 2 seconds to generate for FileMaker to generate and cache that data, but to retrieve it, it's milliseconds. So
thank you.
Another technique is we often use as JSONs as a calculation to represent what a field is. And you can do something along this kind of line here. I'm just going to go into let's go into here's an events table, and it just has a bunch of events, some fictitious events that I've spoken at. And we have this as JSON calculation. If you've never used this technique before, it's basically a JSON set element on every key of importance. That is, I want to bring that data out. And quite often in the systems we build, we'll have 2 or 3 of these. They're very inexpensive because they're not rendered on any layouts or anything, so they're not evaluated. And we'll have thin ones and we'll have wide ones. Sometimes we call it as JSON list. Sometimes we call it as JSON detail. Doesn't really matter too much. But the idea here is it's a JSON object that represents the data in the field. But you could want some pieces of information in here, like some type of a deep calculation. For example, a balance that checks a bunch of invoices and stuff, and that's really, really non-performant. So what you can do is you can have it as JSON static, something along those lines, and you auto enter the evaluation into it. The only trick is you have to trigger the calculation. So the only way to trigger these kinds of calculations is typically to edit something on the parent record. If you have related fields and you try to edit something down there, as you know, in FileMaker, the parent doesn't automatically evaluate. It'd be really nice if that was a feature, but it would probably break a lot of systems in terms of performance. So what we often will do for that, something, I'm not going to code this exactly out, but I'll just sort of pseudo code it, is what we'll do is we'll say, if you want some type of trigger, and you can say something like mod, or I want to call it trigger, let trigger equal. And if I say get modification timestamp, which do I have one right here? If I say let trigger equal modification timestamp, and then put this into an auto enter calc, it'll automatically enter that calculation every time this record is edited, right? Typically with data, it's not edited as much as it's read, because otherwise there'd be no point of saving that data, right? You're always going to read the data more than you're going to write it. The exception is a log. And that's how you can trigger that auto enter to do something like that. So we've done that in a lot of systems that we've built, where we've gone in and realized later on that there's a performance problem. So we've gone in and changed something to be more of a static type calculation, and then we have to programmatically tickle that record, and that causes that auto enter calc to renew. Let me know if you have any questions on those techniques.
Yeah, Charles, real quick, would you have indexed that value as well, or just left it?
No, because you're never searching it. You're never searching.
Okay.
Yeah, you're searching by the primary key, usually.
Right. Okay, perfect.
And not searching on the actual values that are in the as JSON. So it doesn't become a problem there, the indexing part. Again,
Charles, in addition to that, you probably want to make it unstored as well.
Yes. And the funny thing is, we normally never even bother checking that, because most of the time we have one or two related fields that are kind of buried in there. This one here would be that the cached version would be stored, because it's not a calculation, it's pure data, but the as JSON as a calculation is normally unstored.
Right.
And I have a question for you. I use a lot this function, but when you have a child as JSON, so you have a JSON and related record inside the same JSON, you use a custom function, or you simply make a relationship and you add it to JSON?
Yeah, so here's an example of, let me just show you that really quick. Here's an example of, you have people and addresses, right? Very common. I have multiple addresses, home, cottage, that kind of thing. So I have people and addresses here. And then all we did here in the people table is we have an as JSON here. And there's another section here just for clarity. That's the related data. So this is all the data from this top level record. And then the related data, we're pointing to the as JSON that's in that field. Now, this seems really, really inefficient, but it actually isn't, because most of the time when you're pulling this as JSON, like this top level structure with all of the documents underneath it, you're usually pulling that one document. It's some type of a detail view. Like, imagine this is a contact and this is all their addresses. So you're only pulling one record plus the 2 or 3 addresses. So it's pretty performant still. But
yes, but the JSON array from related is a custom function.
Yeah, all this custom function is doing it's looking into this relationship, and it's getting a list of all of the as JSONs that are in there, which will be a FileMaker list, carriage return separated list, replacing the carriage returns with commas and putting square braces on the end. So it's converting it into an array. You can have a look at what the function does. It's pretty simple though.
No, I know. I only want to be sure that on the server side is performed or not.
Yeah, this is fine. Where you're going to lose performance is when you start getting into deep relationships with lots of calculations. And in all honesty, we've built a lot of apps, dozens and dozens, maybe 100 apps or something like that. And I think it was maybe just a week ago or 2 weeks ago, we ran into the first time where we needed to bother to cache this data, because we had a lot of these really deep calculations that were percentages of all kinds of other information and stuff. Hardly ever do you have to do that, that we found, unless you have a really complex situation. Most of the time you can create an as JSON that omits that data, and then you drill into it on your app, and then you fetch the shorter data. Another really important thing is, and I sort of touched on this as well, return really thin objects. Like, if you don't need a bunch of information, don't be a developer and throw every piece of information into the object in case you might need it. Work on the opposite side and say, okay, I don't need anything. Let me just add the stuff that I'm using right today, not the stuff I think I'm going to use tomorrow into it. So don't add the middle name field, don't add the addresses, don't add the date of birth. If you're just showing a list of contacts, show just, first name and last name, or even just a full name for that matter. And that significantly reduces your payloads and your data, and it makes FileMaker not have to work as hard. Another one is return small arrays. Sometimes we see people and they say, how come this hook is performing slow and they're returning 2,000 records? And really they only need 5 or 10 or 20 records. So return just the first 20 records and add some extra metadata into the hook that says, hey, I have another 20 pages or I have another 400 contacts as well. Very, very seldom do you need tons of data on any web app. Like if you can, I'd be very impressed if you could name an app where you have to scroll and scroll and scroll to find a piece of information. I mean, we don't even go to page 2 on Google anymore. It used to be a joke about if you had to go to page 2. We don't even do that. I never, ever go to page 2 now. Right.
So Charles, with that technique, oops, sorry. Hold on. Give me 1 second. Sorry about that.
I think you're muted, Chris. Sorry about that. I didn't do it.
I did. Okay. You can hear me?
Yeah.
All right. Sorry. So how in that situation do you, let's say that I'm returning 400 names and it's just a list detail type situation. And they want it sorted. How are you performantly only returning the 20 with the sort issue?
Yeah. So you can sort, FileMaker does pretty good sorting. All right. So you can sort on FileMaker and return those sets of 20. And you can omit the next, return 20 and omit, starting from 21 on to whatever, omit the rest of them. So you can do that technique. We have a video on preparing JSON for FileMaker or something like that. And I think we talk about that technique. So that's one option. Another option is whatever they're sorting by, maybe you can already prompt them in some fashion to reduce that down even more. For example, if I have a type ahead search, instead of having them type on 1 or 2 characters, they have to enter at least 3. So that gets almost everybody's name still in there. And you reduce the data just by default by them typing, and then nobody realizes that you're waiting a little bit more, right? That's a pretty common approach too.
Okay.
Hey, Charles, real quick, how do you handle invalid characters and things like that in your JSON that brings back invalid JSON? And then 2, when you do your list summaries, how are you replacing the commas and the brackets? Is that with custom function?
Okay, yeah. So there's 2 things. JSON, if you've encoded stuff with JSON set element, it takes care of all of the escaping. As far as inbound sanitation or sanitizing your data, you almost never need to do that with most things anyway, because unless somebody's putting some funky characters in, there's nothing that comes on the query, the search part of the term. You may have to convert things to a lowercase. That happens sometimes. If your FileMaker is not case sensitive in the search, but if you're doing a SQL search, that can be case sensitive, I believe. So I think actually I think Jason just posted something up on the Slack this week regarding that. Jason Dan Smith regarding some recommended changes for reducing case. The outbound data in that as JSON calculations, there's nothing you really need to do there. The custom function takes care of all of that. It's only replacing the carriage return, and there are no carriage returns inside your JSON because they've already been replaced with they've already been escaped with the JSON set element. So that's already taken care of that. We have seen some computational stuff, and we actually are building something. We've been doing a lot of engineering for a project that we're working on, and it's pretty advanced stuff, and we're trying to get these optimizations. In the past couple of days, Eduardo and I have been working together, and we found a couple scenarios where certain types of FileMaker functions are less performant. And this stuff is not new. This has been documented. There's lots of people in the community who've run into this. But one of the ones we noticed was JSON delete element can sometimes be inconsistent in its performance time. I believe that was one of them. And I think the main reason for that is doing a manipulation on effectively a string, and it's has to find the part that you're deleting. Maybe it's the 7th element out of 10. So it's got to look down, traverse that string, figure out where it is, find that part and slice it out. and then return the results. So that's a little bit more performant. We haven't done experiments where it may be cheaper to actually just delete one element at a time off of an array. And this is a case where you're iterating it over an array, or you're cleaning stuff out. It may be more performant. I'm not sure on this, but you may find that if you do run into a situation where you're looking for every millisecond, in our case, this process was taking around 300 milliseconds. So we had to look at each part of the process. So now we got it down to maybe 100 milliseconds or so. Because of those optimizations. You can measure scripts. I don't know if anybody does this ever, but it's pretty easy to do. Measure scripts out to find slow processes. And I'm just going to grab a file here and I'll show you an example of, this is just quick and dirty, but let me just show you an example. Hold on for a quick second. And let me move this out of the way here. Okay, and resume here. Okay, this is just a simple file here, but example file. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to show you just a quick method if you're ever looking to optimize performance. We had some scripts, and this actually was one of the scripts. Doesn't really matter what it does, but we were noticing that we were having some issues with some timing things. So we created in this case, this script actually ran in FileMaker Client or FileMaker Go. It's the target application, but we wanted to measure the time of that. Normally I would use a slightly different process on the server, but I'll show you this one here. And this is really, really simple. I'll move this over here for a second. There we go. All right. And basically all we're doing is we're building just a little log in a global variable. And you've probably already done something like this as well. And where basically what it's doing is it's building an object. We call it after location. It's getting the script name, so we know where this log entry is, and a little bit of detail about where it is. It's line 15. It's after this. It's before I do a call, and so on. I grab an elapsed time, and that's getting time UTC milliseconds minus my $time start, which is a global variable that was set earlier in the system. Once I've grabbed the elapsed time, I reset my time start to this time so I can find the dwell time, the time between this statement and the next statement. So I get those increments. I don't have these big numbers that I have to do the math in my head. And then finally, we are just listing that and putting it into this timer log. So this just builds a nice little log of all these statements. And then if I just do a quick, you can see I've added a bunch of statements in here, 1, 2 here. Basically, even after every one of these statements, just to find out how long did this delete element take? How long did that one take? What took a long time? And I would have thought in this particular process, we're using this universal CRUD, which I'll talk about in a bit, but I would have thought that would have taken a lot of time. But it turns out that other things took time, things like showing a card window and deleting elements. Those kinds of events are what really took the length of the majority of the time, and not the thing that I thought it was. So it's a really simple way of doing that. You just paste the script in there. If you're doing this in a BetterForms hook, you have a hook and it says, wow, this is 4 seconds for some save. I want to know why it's taking 4 seconds. That should not take that long. And it's not obvious to you. What you can do is you can use the same function in here, the same type of code. You can take a screenshot of that. It's pretty simple if you want. And you would throw it into a BetterForms hook. So I would go into something like in any of BetterForms hooks. Here's an on-form request here. You'll always see one of these lines at the top, and it's just a logging line. And it basically just builds this log, and this log gets passed through. This particular global variable gets passed from your business file, your legacy file, into the helper file, and into the helper file inbox log. And all you have to do is basically, it just says where you're at, the script name and start. And I might change this to about to perform something, that kind of thing. And then it gives you an idea of those times, and you can add that timestamp onto there too. It might actually be a good idea if we added some time, so you can just replicate that. Maybe we can do that as a feature request, or somebody wants to in the community wants to do that. Be much appreciated. All right, so those are some things for performance and logging. If you are using a universal CRUD, I'm not sure if anybody does that technique. We use it all the time because it's really simple. But if you are using that method, is to send the minimum amount of data to be saved. Don't save stuff that you don't need to save. It's a technique. It's in our example file that you can download. And it's a technique where we take a JSON object and it has an ID, and it'll either create or update a record based on that ID, and you pass it a table as well. And if there's just maybe one key or two keys in there, it only touches those keys. So it's fairly performant. Not as performant as set field, new record set field, but it's almost as performant as that, and it's way easier to use. Okay, I mentioned already, reduce, reuse, recycle. That same thing applies to developer stuff, and developer optimizations and DevOps in general. We tend to use API first design. We've got a number of videos online on that if you want to see what that strategy is. And it's basically small scripts that do one thing is the fundamental concept. And we reuse those. So we reduce the amount of code because each script is just only doing something. It's not a bunch of conditional statements and stuff. It's only called for that. So most of the time our API scripts don't even have any if statements in them. We reuse those because they're modular, and we recycle code when we can. So we put things into modules that we can cut and paste, and probably most people do that already. If you have any good modules that we can share with our community, we'd much appreciate that. I know a lot of you have made some really good little mods to your helper files and things like that too. So it'd be nice if we could share those easier. So that's the majority of stuff that I have just for the FileMaker side. Again, I mentioned that we had a survey and asked what people were interested in, and most people put optimizations. But what's interesting is our support requests are for the opposite. They're mostly for code generation, not for optimization related things. So I led off with this, but we'll jump into the other things as well. On the BetterForms side, on the front end, the web side and this actually kind of applies to any kind of web application that you're building. Here's just some areas that you can do to look for things. The DOM header insertions in any app. We may have. Let me do this. In any given app, we have an area where we can add in inserts. And in my insertions area here, I'm just going to compress this so you can see it. We have two sections here, and this section here is new that you may not have noticed before. This one is the inserts. These are basically third-party modules that you're adding in. So it's pulling this code into BetterForms environment. And in this case, it's doing it before the app renders. And in the second case, load later, it does it after the app renders. So the app starts to render, and then it grabs the code. That takes a little bit of time. The app continues to render, the code comes back, and it kind of all goes together. So it's not contiguous in terms of time. So if you don't have things, this makes a huge difference in your loading time, the initial load time to first draw or paint in your app. Reduce the stuff that you're not using. You might have said, oh, well, let me try this chart. Let me try full calendar. Let me try all these different libraries. And you have no idea how big those libraries are. And next thing you know, your code base has grown, or these libraries have grown. Most of them will be cached in your browser, so it's not usually too much of a problem on subsequent loads. But on the very first version load, it can slow things down. So you can reduce those. If you have a lot of CDNs, which is a content delivery network delivered files, and you can actually, with some CDNs, you can actually combine the modules. Like, for example, with JS Delivery, you can put 2 or 3 libraries together, and you just, the way you specify them in the URL, it'll put them all as one bundle and it'll send it down to you. I've had mixed results with that. Sometimes they have interaction, sometimes they don't. So you have to kind of experiment. Another thing you can do as well is you can remove, for example, here's a Font Awesome kit. So this is an extra Font Awesome kit. Now, depending on what my first initial page is, I may not care if my Font Awesome kit is loaded right away. So I could move this to, oops. There, I could move this to load later here, and my Font Awesome fonts won't load as early as they did. They'll still work properly for the most part, but I won't have that load right away. So there's a few things you can do there. It's really important to experiment if you're finding that you're loading a package later and you're finding it's not working. One of the reasons why it may not work is if you take a library that is relying on doing something in the DOM. Most packages are a little bit older and they don't realize that you're using a reactive environment, a modern environment like BetterForms or React or Vue, and the library loads and it's looking towards the DOM, towards the divs, and it's trying to maybe put something into one of the divs, maybe a drawing surface or a graphical interface or something. And if that is already drawn or it's not drawn yet, that could be a problem. So sometimes you have to actually load the module a little bit later on. So you have to experiment with at what phase it loads. So you do have to sort of understand it a little bit. One other thing you can do in here too is if you have a function, some people have written some special functions that do, some weird, interesting thing. You can actually add script tags in here. So you can add conventional JavaScript. And in this case, I've added a new function called bf_getPaths. And this is kind of an experimental function. Eventually, it might make its way into the base code. And I've just replicated that function here. I put it here. And now I can just call that from anywhere in my app as well. So that can make something more efficient if I have to reuse this in multiple places. All right. Any questions about those things so far? Eyes glazed over?
Just one comment, Charles. I was looking at that in our site, that area with load first and load later. You might take a look at some of the description that's off on the right-hand side, some of the instructions. It almost looks like it's backwards, but maybe that's just a read. What did I say? Use this area for analytics modules that are needed right away. And I think what you just described was not right away, right? For that lower section.
Yeah, I probably should
Where your
say, or anything
cursor is.
that's not neat. Yeah, I think you're right. You're right.
Okay. Yeah, just to make sure that was clear.
All right. Boom, delegated.
Cool.
This is another cool thing too, is we use Marker.io in your apps. And this is not really about an optimization thing, but it's just easier to do. It's just a script tag that sticks in here in this particular app, and it makes it really easy to report bugs. There's another company called BugHerd, and there's a few other ones I think out now as well. But this one integrates it with Teamwork, which is what we use internally. So it makes it really easy to delegate. And depending on which app it is, it automatically goes to the right person on our team. So Christina's a product manager for this, or owner for this. So she takes care of these kinds of things, and we'll delegate that stuff out. I'll leave. All right. A couple other things here too. Next thing is this is a really big one. This is probably could have led off first, but it's not, maybe in logical order, is our hooks. The more data you send into FileMaker, the longer that data takes there's a big difference between sending 100K and sending 10K in terms of time to arrive at FileMaker server. And then of course, there's much more data that FileMaker server has to process. If you are using the XML gateway, there is some small overhead in converting the XML into into JSON. There's some that's done in BetterForms Cloud, but there's also some that's done in the in the FileMaker interface as well and the web server. So that takes a tiny bit of overhead. It's only usually somewhere between 1 and maybe 10 milliseconds, 20 milliseconds, somewhere in that range. But that can still be considerable if you have a hook that's only running in, say, 20 milliseconds. It's now you've doubled the time. The data API on average doesn't give you any better performance, we found, because one thing that the way BetterForms accesses your XML gateway is it doesn't send the data as a whole bunch of fields. It sends it as one blob, one JSON blob as it goes in. So it's only one sort of XML path to convert. So we gain a lot of performance that way by doing that. And that's therefore the two interfaces are about the same. We haven't noticed any significant differences between the two. If you have, let us know, because we'd like to learn from that. Send the minimum amount of data in the hooks. We have a feature called model filter keys, and a couple Friday Lives ago, Andrew did a presentation on this. And basically the idea is it just filters out all of the stuff and you only send the piece of information that you need. Sometimes it's just one object, or maybe just a primary key, just an ID, and that's only going in flight, and that makes things quite a bit speedier. Return only the minimum data from FileMaker, so don't grab as much as you need. Again, always err on the less than data than over too much. One thing you should always be careful of, we don't have anything confidential in any of our records, but if you do in any of your records, that you don't just blindly add random confidential information into the as JSON, because then it still does end up in the front end. If possible, optimistic saves are really good too. We have a video on that. It's basically really useful when you're doing things like a bunch of checkboxes and I just want to check, and I want those saves to go right away. I don't worry too much about waiting for the data to come back. So we effectively send the data to FileMaker and then we let the front end continue. There's a video on this in one of our Friday Lives from maybe about a year and a half, 2 years ago on that technique as well. And this is some stuff here that, yeah, go ahead.
Question, excuse me. About the last thing that you say, I agree that we don't need to have the return, but if the check create a value that is a summary, on the last page, you need to have the summary. So how I can optimize to not have every time that you click a calculation, but I only want the calculation on the end?
Sure. So that means
you understand?
Yeah, I do. It really means you only need the calculation, right? So that doesn't mean you need to send all the other data back and forth all the time. Just send the new data. So I'll talk about that in a second here. Some different strategies here. So the next one is managing and caching data. If you don't need to send the data back and forth, don't. If you can reuse the data, reuse it. And so it's reduce, reuse, recycle, the same kind of thing here. So a technique that we've been doing quite a bit now in newer apps, and we don't even have our main app totally converted to this, but we do it on the new things as we develop code, is to load the data after the page. Traditionally, you sort of would do an on-form request, and that on-form request would go to FileMaker, fetch the data, and then return and then render the page. Now what we're doing is we are disabling the on-form request. So we're not saying, hey, FileMaker, give me the data. We're actually in the on-form load. This is after the page starts to render. We then call FileMaker. But prior to doing that, we check and we look locally and we say, do I have this data here already? If I do, let me just show it. I'll still call FileMaker, but I'll show this data right now to the user because there's a very high probability that the data hasn't changed between when they were last looking at it. And then when the data comes back, we just update the data again. So you might see something and then one more thing show up later on. You see this in a lot of apps that they do this online. Another technique is to save the data in the app model. So the app is a global model, so you're not fetching it back and forth when you're navigating around. If I go back to page 1 and it's a list view, I still have that same data there with that same technique. And the new data that comes in can automatically go into that app model as well and get updated. Right. This, I think we covered this technique about two Friday Lives ago, roughly. I demonstrated this, so I'm not going to get into the details of it there. All right, caching app. BetterForms has the ability to save data, either in the model, that's the data page, the data model for the page, or the main kind of, you can think of it as like a local variable and a global variable. And we tend to now find that it's better to push the data into the app and then copy it in to the local page. And in fact, we didn't like having to copy it each time, so we added a feature, and this feature is going to be coming out. It's just in beta right now. We have a few people beta testing it. We found a few little glitches, so we're just dialing it in a little bit more. We expect that to be pushed out probably in the next 2 or 3 weeks. We just made another build, I think just a few days ago, Christina did. And basically what it is, it's called Sync with App. And the idea here is that if I have a bunch of pages and I want to share the data from page 1 to page 2, page 3, the data just carries on without you having to do anything. So that's kind of a nice little improvement. We talked about that in the last Friday Live, so I won't go into it into too much detail. You can also use local storage to save data. So if you have a lot of data that even if it changes often, it doesn't really matter. You're not concerned about that data being a security thing. So if I have a list of contacts and it's on somebody's computer and I save it in local storage, it's saved in that computer. And that's potentially kind of dangerous. In that case, you can use cache and tab, which will only, it'll survive page refreshes, but it won't survive the closing of the browser or closing of the tab. If you have something that's like, for example, a BetterForms snippets, that's not a security breach. If somebody was to hack your computer, it doesn't put anybody at jeopardy. So we can cache that in the browser so that we don't have to download that every time, or you don't have to wait for it to download. So those kinds of things. So some things make sense to cache temporarily, and some things make sense to cache in the long term. Again, these are all optimization things, and everybody knows that you shouldn't optimize early, optimize as you run into issues, right? So as you see the issues. Sync with App, I just mentioned. Reusing data this is a new concept, and Andrew, I think, has got a demonstration today on that, I believe. And basically, this is a concept that we're just kind of evolving now. We've got maybe 2 or 3 apps that we've built with this strategy. And what we're doing is, if you think about data in terms of a document, right? For example, I have a contact, and that contact has an invoice. They have several invoices. And that invoice has an address field, and it has line items. And maybe if I dig in, I have maybe even product information. Product information is a little bit different here. Oops, where'd we go? This one? Yeah, there we go. So when I load my list view, I really just want to kind of load this data in. And then as I click on this very first one, I want to load the detail for this and maybe this data in, right? And as I click on this one, I want to load this data and load this data in. It's a tree. And then if I jump back and I go into this over here, I already have some of that data. So now I just have to load the next little piece of the tree so we can kind of fill out this tree. Now it sounds kind of complicated, but it actually, in terms of code, it's very, very simple the way it works. We'll just jump over to Andrew in just a few seconds there. I'm just going to talk about a couple other little quick things. And I think he's going to give us, and correct me if I'm wrong, Andrew, going to give us a demo on that.
I need a little bit to get that set up.
Okay. And there's one other thing I want to talk about quick too, and this is advanced data systems. Right now, BetterForms directly talks to FileMaker, but it's not really opinionated to FileMaker. It never was. It doesn't have a tight coupling. It's loosely coupled, meaning that it can connect to other things as well. In fact, I think Jason Wood, as an experiment, did a connection where he connected BetterForms to a Node-RED to a Mongo database. And using that same technology, you can connect it to anything you want. It doesn't really matter. One of the things we've been experimenting is with document databases, things like Realm, which is Mongo's client-side database. We've looked at Firestore, RxDB, a couple other ones we've been experimenting a lot with as well. And they have some really, really neat benefits. Some of them have really, really great offline support. So they have a full database that can use up to all the storage in the browser or in your device. So on my phone, it's, you know, gigabytes of data I can have in my database, very similar to FileMaker Go. They can do eventual consistency. So that means you don't have to do anything you don't have to take care of synchronizing your data. The data just synchronizes. One disadvantage of doing this is you have to replicate the business logic that the device is doing on the front end. So if you want to have offline performance, you can do that, but you have to replicate some of that business logic. Typically, that's not a big thing because the business logic that somebody's using a handheld device or a tablet for is very, very narrow scoped. Hey, I'm going in, I'm taking pictures, I'm editing things, I'm capturing signatures, I'm checking things off of a list, right? It's very, very narrow workflows or very short workflows. They're not generating reports and then getting summaries and all this kind of crazy stuff that you do on regular FileMaker. A little bit more work to build, but you can take that data and you can synchronize it. It is possible to synchronize it into FileMaker and have all of that data flow in and out of FileMaker evenly. So that's very, very interesting. And one other concept, and this is a really interesting one as well. And we're not going to get into this, but it's called CRDT. And the concept here is that you have conflict-free replicated data. So basically it means a bunch of devices and they all just synchronize up and you never have conflicts that you have to worry about for synchronizing. So that's kind of some of the stuff that is possible. If you're ever interested in doing that, you can contact us on the team and, you know, we can sort of share some of our findings and our thoughts there. One last thing, and you should virtually never have to do this unless you have some really, really bad code, is JavaScript optimization. There are some edge cases where you may be looping through really massive amounts of data on the front end, and that's giving you some kind of poor performance, but virtually never. JavaScript is pretty optimized, even though it's a script language. It's not a compiled language. It's got these little micro compilations. It's pretty performant, right? As you know. So we shouldn't have to do that too much. That's what I have mainly for application notes and things like that. And I'll share this in our email follow-up link that our marketing person will send out. Does anybody have any questions about this stuff so far? Okay. All right. I'm going to stop my share. Are you good to go, Andrew, or do you need a bit more time?
I can showcase it now.
All right.
So this shouldn't take too long. What I want to showcase here is an app that we're working on called GreenRock. I'm sure Chris is familiar. But the idea with GreenRock is you have a list of properties on the left-hand side here. And inside of each property, you might have things like the detail, the projects, the meter ratings, the users, etc. So the object for the property can be quite large if you send out data at once. So rather than sending out the data at once, what you can do is essentially grab that data as you need it and then slot it into the property at that point in time. So for example, if you're in a property here and you head over to the app model, you can see the property object is, it's large, but it's not massive that it would cause any performance issues. But you can go into something like projects. And then once you're in the projects, then the projects list gets grabbed and we slot it right into the property at that point in time here. And then you can go one level deeper. Once you're in a project, you can go into kind of the project details and grab things like the description, the comments, etc. So idea being, you're not grabbing all of the data related to the property at that time, but you're building it as you go along. And then combining that with kind of what Charles talked about earlier with saving everything in app, that data can be reused. For example, if I switch over to something like Blazer Hall, we grab that data, but then if you switch back to the original property, that data already exists in the app model. So I don't need to grab that data anymore. So what you'll see is it will instantly populate like so. And that doesn't mean that the data is stale. What it does is it'll grab the data you have available at that point in time, but also run a fetch in the background to grab new data and then just populate it here. I didn't make any changes, so you don't notice any change. If I switch back to Blazer Hall, you'll see that it loads pretty much instantaneously. And that's not just for switching between properties, but also switching between pages. So I'm on the projects page here. If I go to the users table, grab the users, switching back to the projects, I don't have to run a fetch for all those projects anymore because I have that data to reuse in the app model. So you notice how switching between projects, properties, and pages is quite performant, and you don't notice all the fetching going on in the background. I think that covers most of it. Charles, anything else?
No, it's nice. Could you switch to users again? And then switch to properties? Sorry about that. That's the problem with having multiple devices all sitting. There we go. All sitting beside each other. You go mute one and it goes on to another one. It goes on to another one. Yeah, now it's on this one. Sorry about that. I just want to mention one quick thing is you do see a quick spinner there, and we've actually addressed this in our newest code base. Just switch to users. And what's happening is BetterForms still needs to fetch the JSON, the schema for the page design. But one of the features that Eduardo's recently coded in is that is actually cached. And in a newer code base, there won't even be that little pause in there. It'll be even less because we've actually saved or pre-cached all of the schema that you've written, all of the design of the page. So we've kind of starting to take more of an optimistic approach to data management.
We had a comment from Dan that if you wanted to take a look at that.
Do you use timestamps to see if the data is stale? No, what it's doing is it's doing, I guess you could think of it like an optimistic load instead of an optimistic save. It's looking at the data and it's still doing the same form request from FileMaker's server. The server is not that burdened that you have to minimize that. And it's loading that newest data, which is virtually identical 99.9% of the time, loading it on top of the old data. So it's just refreshing the data. Oh, you're welcome. All right, great. Thank you, Andrew. That's awesome. Looks really nice. Does anybody else have any performance tips that they could share? Maybe they found with even running their FileMaker server, best instance types, those kinds of things. Do you guys find that every now and then AWS, for example, that's who we use mostly for hosting. Every now and then that changes around a little bit with the types of instances, the storage mechanisms and things like that. For example, Jason, have you found that anything is significantly better than your regular EC2, T2, whatever instances? Okay, well, we're going to jump into our second half here, and I'm going to share my screen again. All right, just want to confirm: is this the screen I'm sharing?
Yep. Okay,
thank you. All right, I want to talk about every time I flip on my YouTube, every time I go through Twitter, I see Chat GPT. I see all this stuff. And of course, I think we're starting to finally see all the poems and the cheesy raps and everything like that. And I've done my share as well. And now we're actually starting to see the real world use case. And it's kind of reminds me of my first computer. We you know, it was all recipe databases and all this kind of stuff. And now then we started to actually have real use cases for them. So I'm just going to move this over to here for a quick sec, just to make sure I got all my stuff here. All right, I want to talk. Has anybody used GPT, Chat GPT for code, any kind of code assistance? And then second question is, have you used GPT, OpenAI's API for any kind of code generation or data generation in your apps at all?
I tried it a week ago.
So not too much. And what did you, if you don't mind me asking, what did you try doing?
Well, since I don't know much about JavaScript, I wanted an example of an HTML that has 2 listeners.
Great.
And I did a regular Google search and came up with all kinds of pages, but the examples weren't good. The information wasn't what I was looking for.
Mhm.
So I tried Chat GPT. I asked it to generate code, and it did. It worked. It gave me an example page. I saved it, opened up an HTML, and it worked.
I want to take you, thank you for sharing that. I think it was Dan. I want to take you through, I'll take you through a bit of a journey, my findings of where we're at today. And of course, you know, 6 months, who knows what's going on. We'll look at it from a FileMaker perspective, and then we'll kind of plug along going forward. And I've got some sort of demos or some examples here. And the first one I want to use is, one of the big things is about prompting, and you hear this term prompt engineering, and it really prompt engineering is just say, don't be lazy and give it lots of information. Don't expect to type 5 words like in Google and get the answer. It's not like that. You have to give it lots of information. And in fact, the more information you give it, the better it is. So in this case, and the too long didn't read of this part is Chat GPT doesn't know that much about FileMaker, but it does know some things, and it can do some things really well and really bad. And I'll show you what the differences are. Here I have in a FileMaker app, I have a web viewer. I wanted to see what it can do, how much it understands about web viewers and things like that. I want to call a JavaScript function in the web viewer that will return name first and name last arguments concatenated. The name first and name last values are in FileMaker table called contacts. You can access that with the layout called context detail. So I gave it all the information, and this is really, really key. I want to return the result and insert it into a field. So I wanted to get the result from the web viewer, right? And insert it into a field called typo, name full in the same table. So there must be a third table there, or a third field. Create the HTML code that I can use in FileMaker to set the web viewer as a data URL. Now, I specifically said that, and this is really, really key here for this, because otherwise it doesn't quite get it. Include both the FileMaker and HTML.js code. All right, and here's what it produced. Now, ignore this. This is the editor that they're using in this particular app, and it's auto-identifying this as PHP and not as FileMaker. But what's interesting is it actually generated a proper data URL that we need to paste into a web viewer. It's created a proper web page here. It's not formatted, but it created the proper page. It added a script tag. So if you know some JavaScript, this is basically a JavaScript, and it created a function called concatenating name. So it created this function, var name first, and then it actually grabbed this, and it did this a little bit wrong, this part here, and it's actually grabbed, let me close that, there we go, the first name from an input field or from some kind of field here, and we'll see what it's doing later on. And then it's calculating var full name is name first name plus last name, and then it's returning the full name, and that's what the function does. But I don't see where this function is actually called. Oh, no, here it is here. Okay, sorry, I missed it. I couldn't see it off screen. So it actually put input fields on the page, and it didn't actually take the input fields from FileMaker. So it kind of made a mistake there, right? Didn't quite get it, even though I said where the data was sourced from. So it's not really great at that merge between the two. But if you break this down into 2 separate parts, you can really, really leverage some of the stuff. I said, where's my FileMaker script? Because it didn't include the script. And it says, to complete the function. And then it got the FileMaker script. So this is kind of interesting too. Set variable HTML, which is proper FileMaker thing. It's actually formatted this in a similar way to the majority of the way most FileMaker developers would format HTML. We don't have the ability to have like a template, a string, but they put everything on separate lines and concatenated it all together. And then it says set web viewer with this URL. Now, since it's a data URL right here, it's a data URL. This will actually properly work. And then it says go to object web viewer, concatenated name. So it's creating the web viewer here and it's setting it, right? And it's telling you how to use it. So I would say I would give it kind of a pass, but not quite a pass on something like that. So then I tried and I played around. I reduced a lot of these examples here. I created another one and I said, write a FileMaker. And of course, in my typical typo fashion, I just left the typos in there. Write a FileMaker custom function that accepts two arguments. The first argument being a JSON array called edits. And the second one is this. So this was kind of a complex problem that I was working on. And I wanted to see if it could do anything. Right. So I gave it some sample JSON, and this really helps a lot. I find if you take the time, and it really does take the time. It's worth taking the time. And then I gave it an example, and I said the second argument is a UTC thing. And basically, I wanted to make some complex object out of these two entries here, merge them together based on timestamps and things like that. And here's something I've really found that's really important if you're prompting for code. You're going to do something that's going to be slightly wrong. There's two options you can do. You can try to correct it in the next statement, and it'll take that stuff and it'll kind of evaluate up to that point. Or you can go back and edit the first statement with the stuff that's already asking you in the second statement to dial in your first statement a little bit more. And there's times when you do one, times when you do the other. When it starts to go wrong, I find Chat GPT generally doesn't fix itself. Once it goes down a thought process with the wrong branch of code, you're better off just to jump up and edit the earlier one. If it's on the right path, then you're better off to just continue. But this is really key if you're prompting, is to continue to ask me questions until you fully understand the task. And by doing this, it doesn't try to come to a conclusion right away. It usually says, oh, I don't know what's happening internally, but in my head, it's kind of like going to these branches and saying, yeah, I don't know what to do from here. I kind of get it. So it asks me some more information, an array of JSON objects, and it's just asking me for some clarification. I said, correct. Great. He said, here's a custom function. So I'm thinking, okay, this is a FileMaker custom function. Great. We got the comments in there. We got the lets, right? That looks pretty good, right? Comments and let, all right? That's correct. That's exactly how I format my lets. And then it says edits equals, and then it's got this thing JSON parse. All right, that's not a FileMaker command, at least not to my knowledge, it isn't. All right. And I think, do we have a filter values? Yeah, we have maybe, I think I got a custom function filter values, but it doesn't take into a function key. So it's got this kind of blend of JavaScript mixed in its head here going on. So for generating, I would say for generating custom functions, it's a fail. That's been my experience. Now, that course, that could very well change with more training and more or bigger community. You guys need to post more so I can learn more maybe, and so on. Later on, it just says how to call my custom function. This part is correct. Pure FileMaker stuff, it's not too bad at, but the combination of FileMaker and custom functions and things like that, not so good. I even mentioned to it, I said, the code looks like a mix of JavaScript and FileMaker, and it says, I apologize. And then it just went and did it again because it clearly doesn't understand or know anymore. So what is it good for? Well, I took a relatively big, this is actually small at the time. I know it's actually pretty big. This is a FileMaker auto-enter calculation. So it's a pretty big calculation you can see here, and it's doing some relatively complex stuff. I said, analyze what it does. And at the end of the day, Oh no, so let me just see what they asked it to do and apply appropriate comments. Oh, he said analyze what it does and add appropriate comments to it. I said comment this thing because it's not that much comment, not that many comments in here. Return the edited code with commented lines. So it went and commented all the stuff, and it actually did a pretty good job about commenting. Although it's a little bit overzealous with the comments, I don't need to. I think the stuff is somewhat self-explanatory. But I've also given it the same custom function here. And this time I said, tell me what the following FileMaker custom function does. And it says this custom function was written in a FileMaker language. The function defines several variables. Let me just see. It does mention, okay, so what is it for, is what I asked after it kind of made the obvious. It's difficult to say, but it basically says it's designed to create a JSON object representing the current record, including only the fields that were modified in their code and their corresponding values, which is exactly what it does. It's a kind of like an audit log. The function also includes timestamps for each modified field. The approach of the system is to track data changes over time, even if those changes were made while the system was offline or disconnected. And this is exactly what this thing does. It does handle some disconnected states, right? I even asked it what a specific timestamp is for, and it said, it even nailed the reason why we added that timestamp in there. So it was really, really good at analyzing code. So the takeaway on the FileMaker side, not the JavaScript side, but the takeaway on the FileMaker side is it's really good for analyzing. And I give this like an A+ for analyzing. But for generating FileMaker stuff, I don't think it can generate any FileMaker script that anybody in our group, even if you're a beginner scripter, you could probably do the same, more or less the same thing. And for FileMaker function, like FileMaker calculation engine stuff, it's definitely a fail. I wouldn't even look at it too much for that. You may be able to, for the code analysis and any of those things, I think give it an A+. So it's really, really good there. Here's another really complex one. This is somebody asked me this. I think it was somebody in our team. And I said, hey, how do I do this? So I just plunked it in. I said JavaScript, and then JavaScript. Now we're getting to JavaScript now. I want to take a file that user selects and converts it to base 64 so I can send it back to the back end. The back end function is called BF named action save file. So I actually gave it the name of the, how in Java, in BetterForms, how you call the function a named action, how I'd call that hook. So I told it that. And it did a pretty good job of this. It basically grabbed the information, it converted it to base 64, and it sent it to the front end. So it's a quick upload button. So again, another A+ on that one. If you've ever used any kind of regular expressions, that's like a whole, I've mentioned this before, but LinkedIn Learning has a 6-hour course on regular expressions and how to use them. They're really complex, really hard, but they're crazy powerful. So I gave it a challenge here. I said, my name is Charles, and I have a string, and my string is, my name is Charles, my cell is 905, blah, blah, blah. That's not my cell. And you can call me, and if I'm busy, call a different number. And it's a slightly different format. This one's got brackets around. This one just has hyphens, and write JavaScript regex to parse out the phone number. So this is a really typical thing that you might do in BetterForms to maybe grab some information, or you maybe even do it in some other pieces of code. And it did a pretty good job here. It actually managed to get, in case I put the dots, like in Europe, some people put, I think, dots in between these parts of the phone numbers, and it actually included that option there. So it did a pretty good job there too. This was another one that somebody had suggested, and I tried that. So again, generating JavaScript is like an A+. And the reason for that is there's just so much information out there to learn from. All right. So what can you guys do with it, I guess, is a question. Any questions so far? Simply as a learning tool, I think Dan mentioned he looked for something. One of the cool things about it is that you can say, hey, explain this. What does this do? What does that do? And it's right away giving you those answers. And on the comprehension side of what something does, it's really, really good. So you can reasonably rely on that information. This is just something simple. Everybody might have used like a console.log here. I forgot what the alternatives for. I could have Googled them, but I just looked them up here just the same. The other day, so somebody was in the forum just the other day here, and they had a support call or support question, and they said, where is it here? Is a way to have the filter in Tailwind stackable column example, just like the one in the table. So he wants to basically, I'm just going to open this up so we can see it. Here's a really common thing. You want to create some custom code and you want to go outside sort of the BetterForms default elements, but they have a lot of stuff built in, but you're not going to have any of that built in stuff. So it's like he wants to put some type of type ahead thing here or type in thing and filter this stuff down below. Right. Just like he has it here. So that's his goal. So he wants to be able to filter onto that. And I think I made an example for this. I prompted it in. I just want to show you how easy it was to solve that. Let me just find this code to filter an array. Okay. So here's the prompt that I gave to solve Meng Fu's problem. It said in JavaScript, write a code to filter an array. And the takeaways here are the wording. Right. The contacts to search are in a variable called model.contacts. You notice I specified model in there because then I don't have to change the code. The code that GPT generates is going to be nearly identical to my final code, and there's less chance of having bugs. And the array looks like, and now this doesn't have to be valid JSON. It's got to kind of be it's kind of inferred as valid JSON. So I gave it one JSON object, name and age, and I put ... more objects here. Good enough. The search query is in a variable called model.query and would be something like this, CHA or 47. Probably 37 would have been a better example. I want to return a filtered array in model.filtered contact. So I even told it the output of where I want this code to go, right? So I told it all of the stuff about where my data inputs and outputs are. The code should, and this is a tricky thing normally, the code should ignore case and search the object key specified in variable model.keys to filter. And that looks like this, name and age. So I wanted to make this code that it generates flexible enough that I could add and remove fields because I don't know what fields he's going to use. And then I said, continue to ask me questions until you fully understand, and ask me a few questions. I answered those questions. It actually asked me really, really smart questions too. Should the filtered array only contain the objects that match the search query in at least one or one of the specified keys? So it's saying, can it do an or search on any of the fields, or does it have to be and? Should the age be filtered as a string or number? Now, this is one that would probably catch most people, right? Should the search query match the beginning of the string or any part of the string? Right. So I answered, and it generated some code. Now, the beauty about this is, you can literally take this exact piece of code and pop it into a named action that's triggered on an on changed actions on the query field, and it'll work. Right? It's actually pretty decent. It's basically it iterates over the keys. Once it finds a match, it's considers it a match, and then it puts the value back in. So it does a really, really good job of doing stuff like that. I would say probably about 70% of our support questions probably could be answered with just a bit of good prompting. I want to show you one more thing here, and then I'll show you something that I built that uses the API. This is a Tailwind and HTML example. So I said, using Tailwind, CSS, and Vue.js, create the following: a wrapping cards display grid of contacts located in var.model contacts. Here's an example contact. The theme should be modern. Ask me questions until you understand. You do not need to create a Vue.js component, just an HTML component. And this is kind of some special stuff because it's trying to create, it doesn't realize that we don't have to do all of this heavy lifting in BetterForms. So it's trying to create all of this extra stuff. And I also said, use a v4 iterator with a typo on the array. It's pretty good at ignoring my typos. Excuse me. And it actually didn't do too bad of a job. It actually made a little bit of a mistake, I think, in here. So I corrected this example later on. I'm going to show you in a few minutes, and I'll show you what it produces here. The takeaway is that if you're ever trying to build something in HTML or Vue or Tailwind, even for that matter, you can actually go to Chat GPT and it'll solve most of your problems there. You can give it a block of text and say, hey, I want to put a blue border on that div. And it can do that. It can put a blue border on around it. Or I want to change the background color and I don't know how to change it. I paste the code in there and it'll just change it. Okay, any questions about this stuff so far? All right, I'll leave it at that. And I am going to show you something that I've built that will hopefully help some people play around a little bit more. And no, it's called open. There's a whole bunch of these piggyback apps that kind of play on GPT-3, and of course we built one as well. We made this in about 6 hours, so it didn't really take long. And I call it prompt. And basically the idea is this does not have a back end. This app uses local storage. And if you go to Playground GPT-3 or GPT, I should say, you can get an API key. Oh, no. Let me just see here. Okay, I'm going to have to do this myself here. You actually have to grab a Playground. It looks like I lost my key in a recent update. To view API keys. So you basically go in here, you create an API key. You didn't see that. We'll delete that one later on. And you go into here, you paste your key in. And I think it just remembers, yeah, and it'll just save your key. You don't even have to hit save here. Okay, so I got an API key in here. And I have a couple examples that I've made in here already. But basically, I can create a new prompt. But I'm going to start with this one here. And here's how this works. This is a very, very simple application, but it's just a wrapper around the API. And more importantly, it allows you to change data sets. So here, I basically just have the name of the function, and I have the prompt that I want to wrap around the data sets that maybe my client wants to have. For example, you have a client, one of our clients has a summer camp registration app, and maybe they come up to them and say, we want something for the camp counselors to generate games that the kids can play. And some of these inputs might be things like how many kids, how long the game should last, is it an individual game or a team game, and so on. So you basically build these prompts. And in this case, it says write JavaScript code. The code will run inside a function and have access to variables model and app. The model object typically looks like, and then I put this merge tag in here, and I can add these merge tags in automatically. I'll show you how that works in a second. And the code will, and I said the code will, and then the prompt. So now here, this is name first is the model. And it says for the prompt, reverse the model name first string and save it to model dot first name reversed, include a sample of the output. And fingers crossed, excuse me. All right. Interesting. So it basically rearranged that code. Let me just make this bigger so you can see it a bit better here. It actually wrote me the JavaScript that I can just plug in right in here. So here's my prompt for this. Now, the reason I added this program is I figured if we're ever building stuff for let's say FileMaker to do the API calls, and we want to make sure that our prompt is robust enough that the user doesn't enter the prompt, the user only enters this information, the data bits. We want to test it with multiple data sets. So if I go into my second data set, I can say, maybe my model would be something else, whatever my model is. And maybe it's going to be something like name first. And my app model won't have anything. And it'll say, I'll say, let's see, it'll convert. The uppercase. And with a bit of luck, it'll write the code to do that. Or we might have a bug. Oh, there we go. Okay, there. So model name is meant to uppercase. So it actually wrote the code, very simple code, of course, right? But you could put more complex code from the actual data models, and you're trying to figure out how to filter something or do something like that. You can use that for this. Let me give you another example. Is here, this one here, tailwind-based card grid. So I wrote a prompt. I give it some data and a card design. In this case, I don't even tell it what to do. I just tell it the sunshine yellow like a sun. It's going to make some card grids, and I do that. And there's my old one from my last response. So it should probably come up to the same thing. And it generated actual code that will generate data from my card. And it makes a card with a background of yellow somewhere in here, right here. And it actually rounded full. So it makes a full round happy face with my cards. So you can use that to generate stuff. Let me give you one more example with fake data. This is kind of cool. Right. Generate fake test data. Guys, I have somebody banging on my door. I really apologize, but could you give me 2 minutes? I'm really, really sorry about that. They keep persistently, if you don't mind. Sorry about that. I hate to do this.
Hope it makes it back.
Hopefully.
Hello, I'm Giancarlo. Have any one of you tested the Claris Pro?
What kind of answer do you want?
Well, my main complaint is that there aren't the script step to handle account creation, deletion. The account script steps are not there anymore. Oh, there is Charles.
Hey there. Sorry about that.
I mute myself.
That's okay. You can keep going.
No, I was talking about the Claris Pro, the absence of the account script steps, which I found unbelievable to see missing inside the product. But this is not the right time to do that. We are also recording. I was forgetting that.
That's okay.
No.
All right. The object will return keys, and then you can put merge keys in here. Actually, I'm going to put them down on the next line. It will contain keys. Contain keys, and I'm going to say key list. And you notice it's automatically creates a an input box here. Oh, and I want to say generate the key values will be based on the key names and generate objects. And this will be count number of number of objects. There. Okay. So now I go key list. I'm going to say name first, name last, age, sex. That's good. And let's create 3. Okay. So here we go. So let's try that. That's our sort of our first part of our prompt. And let's see how it does there. All right. So not too bad, right? So it's generated John Smith, age, male, Jane Doe, Jack Johnson, and so on. So this is pretty cool because now you can generate, let me save that one. Now you can generate data exactly based on your model if you want to generate some test data. There are lots of sites to do that, but I think this is way easier, right? And more importantly, you can generate or you can adjust this prompt with these inputs, and these could be FileMaker fields. And now you can use this with a very, very simple query call. It's not hard to do this call. I'll show you the FileMaker or the BetterForms version because it's doing it right from the browser. But in FileMaker, it's almost equally as easy. Okay, so I have a script here, and it's pretty simple. And this is it here. It's basically doing a fetch. So you can use the FileMaker request script if you want, the HTTP request script, and it's fetching data. It's including an API key for the authorization, and I specify a number of tokens. Right now, it's just using a default model, but you can adjust that easy enough. So at any rate, we'll release this and make it available to you. You can play with it and hack it up and do whatever you want with it. Let me know what you think.
Very cool, Charles.
I think so. It's kind of
Really cool.
So
I noticed right now when I go to that site that it's live. Should we not be on there until you?
no, you can use it now. You can go to this one here, OpenAI, but I'll probably change the name.
Okay. As far as like API keys and accounts and all that, we don't need that.
API key, you'll have to grab it from OpenAPI.
But I didn't need a account. I just got in and it said, "Welcome, Charles Dells," with your API key sitting.
Oh yeah, that's probably the does it have a key in there?
Yes.
Probably shouldn't have the key in there. I'll probably have to blow that out. So
I mean, it's X'd out, but
okay, then
SK-XX.
yeah, there's no key in there yet then.
Okay. Oh, that's the, I see. Yeah. Okay, got it.
Okay. Well, that's the end of my presentation for today, and I hope you got something out of this stuff. Does anybody have any questions on any of the code generation, OpenAPI, or anything like that?
Have you ever had any issues, Charles, where where on Chat GPT, it'll start writing the code, get about halfway through, and then stops?
Yeah, here's what you do. Just put please continue.
Yeah.
That's it. Yeah.
I tried that, and then it just kept repeating the same bit and stopping at the same place. Yeah.
No, I've been successful with it. Please continue, but I'm not sure. You might want to Google that. That's where I found it from.
Okay. Yeah, I was just having to play around with create a date of birth picker, just to have a play, and it just kept doing the same thing and stopping at the same place. Okay, maybe I didn't try please continue. Maybe I tried something else. All right, I'll give that a go. Thanks.
Okay, Andrew.
Charles, when you get code from Chat GPT, how much modification you have to make that they make little mistakes? Did you
try to make the prompts really accurate, and you hardly have to do any, but you will have to read through because sometimes it can be just like wrong.
Yeah.
Should we do the swag draw?
Yeah. Could you, Andrew, I'm going to have to jump off, or not jump off, but I have to leave my screen for just a quick sec. Could you run that? Take care of that, if you don't mind.
Sure, I'll do that.
All right. We're going to have a quick draw. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop our recording now. Thank you, everybody, for coming out this week, and we'll see you in a month.